What's up? So we know in Magic there are a lot of dual lands. They've been printed for the whole history of Magic, so it can get a little bit overwhelming to decide which ones are good for my deck and which ones do I need to play, which ones should I play, and which ones are just not worth it. So today we're going over dual lands. We're going to go over basically every relevant cycle of dual lands and talking about what formats they're good in, what situations you would play them, and talking about whether you want to play them in 3 color decks, 4 color decks, 2 color decks, those types of things. So, anyways, we're also rating each cycle, starting with our best cycle of dual lands, the fetch lands. So I put this on Beyond S tier because these are the best lands in Magic, just like non no contest nonstop, no competition whatsoever. The fetch lands. So one of the best things about these fetch lands is that they give you perfect mana fixing if you're playing, let's say, a 3 color or a 4 color deck. Let's take Windswept Heath or Scalding Tarn for instance. So Windswept Heath is a land that can search for a forest or plains. If you play a lot of dual lands like Shocklands and lands of land types like the original dual lands, this Windswept Heath can get you a green white land, of course. It can also get you a green red land. It can get you a green blue land. It can get you a green black land. It can get you a white red land. It can get you a white blue land. So if you're playing, let's say, Abzan, Windswept Heath can get you all of your colors. If you're playing Abzan plus red, I don't know what that's called, 4 color Abzan plus red, every color but blue, Windswept Heath can find you all of your colors. If you're playing a 5 color deck, it can find you all of your colors. So these fetch lands are very good at getting you basically perfect mana fixing in combination with shock lands or lands of land types like the OG dual lands. Another thing is that these can find basics. So if your opponent is a deck that plays Blood Moon or Ruination or anything like back to basics, you can use your Windswept Heath to get a forest. Just a basic forest, right? And so that way you can play around your opponent's things like that. They trigger landfall twice. So if you have a landfall card like Rampaging Balefs or Avenger of Zendikar or Valakut the Molten Pinnacle, a fetch land will trigger because it comes in as a land, but then you fetch to get another land into play, and that triggers again. So it triggers landfall twice. I know zoo decks in Modern like that. I know there's certain decks that play like Tireless Tracker or Valakut in Modern that like that. In EDH, it's more relevant because you have a lot more landfall cards. I know Avengers in the Car is a big one. Rampaging Balefs is really good. This also puts a land in the graveyard, so this is important if you're playing a Delirium deck or if you're playing a deck with lots of Delve spells. So in Modern, for instance, if you're playing something like a Dragon Rage Chandler, which gets buffed from Delirium, or you're playing a deck that wants to put lots of cards in the graveyard, a fetch land is going to be really good because it puts another card in your graveyard and it puts a land in the graveyard, which is good for cards that count land types, such as things like Delirium or Tarmogoyf, for instance. You can also recur these lands from the graveyard if you have something like Life from the Loam or Ramanop Excavator or Crucible of Worlds. So, like, if you fetch this and you have Ramanop Excavator in play, you can get the land from the graveyard again, and that basically gives you another land drop if you're playing cards like that. So pretty versatile in that situation. Now let's talk about the shuffling because the shuffling is actually one of the most important parts of the fetch land because they can clear the top of your deck. Now in Legacy, a lot of players will play Brainstorm, and Brainstorm says draw 3 and put 2 back, so it really only puts you up 1. But what players will do is they'll draw 3 cards, put 2 cards that are basically dead or that they don't want on top of their deck, then crack a fetch land to shuffle those back in, basically clearing their deck so they don't draw those again. And so they basically drew 3 cards. You can use this as Sensei's Divining Top in EDH. It lets you look at the top 3 cards. You don't like any of those top 3, you don't want to rearrange them, you don't care about them, just use a fetch land to clear them, and then you can use Sensei's Divining Top again to look at the top 3 of another time, and hopefully you like them more. Jason Mind Sculptor also does something similar. The weakness of fetch lands is that they don't tap for mana by themselves. So, depending on how many fetchables you have in your deck, that could be a bad situation. They're also weak versus cards that stop you from searching, such as Ashiok or Opposition Agent, but those are such a corner case. These are by far the best lands because of the mana fixing, because of how they can find basics, because of their gameplay implications with Delirium and Delve clearing the top of your deck, and also can trigger landfall twice. These are just the best lands. Now, in combination with fetch lands, the shocks and duels let you basically get perfect mana. So the land types allow them to be fetched with fetch lands or certain ramp spells. Combined with fetches give you a near perfect mana. So we have the dual land Savannah. It just taps for green or white. These are legal in Legacy and EDH. And then you have the shock lands. These are legal in basically every format, I think. As it enters the battlefield, you may pay 2 life. If you don't, it enters the battlefield tapped. These are basically worse versions of the dual lands, but they're a lot cheaper money wise. And in EDH, you don't really care about those 2 lives. These are no downside, always untapped sources of 2 colors of mana. You can't get any better than this. And you can't get any better than these as far as actual mana sources. The Shockland's downside of 2 life is no big deal in EDH. It can actually be an upside if you're playing cards like Death Shadow or Rowan Scion of War. So one cool thing you can do, Rowan Scion of War is a commander where you can tap to make spells you spells you cast cost X less to cast, where X is the amount of life you lost. So you can shock in a fetch land and then trigger it to make your spells cost 2 less. Death Shadow, it has power and toughness greater the less life you have. So if you have less than 13 life, it's going to be a big creature. So in Modern and in Legacy, a lot of decks will aggressively shock themselves with the Shockland so that they can get a Death Shadow out, which is only 1 mana, so they can get it out as like 1 mana 5/5 or 1 mana 6/6, depending on how much life they lost from the Shocklands. So the downside of losing 2 life is real in some decks, but in EDH it's not that important, and in some decks it can actually be an upside. So yeah, these are I would say auto include these in like every deck that's not a 1-color deck. You want to play shocks and you want to play fetches in any sort of 2-color or more decks. Let's go next. We have the Pain lands and the Horizon lands. So these are your EDH staples. So this is your A tier. The reason they're A tier is that they're untapped sources of 2 colors of mana that are always untapped. So you play this, you play Brushland, it's always going to enter untapped, going to tap for green or white, always. They don't have land types, so they cannot be fetched, which is why they're not S tier. So you don't really see these in Modern or Legacy. Actually, you kind of do. You see the Horizon lands in Modern. You see the Pain lands sometimes in Modern, but you don't really see them in Legacy. You see these a whole bunch in EDH because of the singleton aspect to that. But they don't have land types, so that's why they're not S tier. The Pain lands can tap for colorless mana, which makes them useful in decks that use like Eldrazi spells. Like I know Bant Eldrazi in Modern used it so they could play Eldrazi Displacer. The colorless tap also doesn't cost life, so if you don't need that green or white mana, you can just tap it for colorless. It's relevant in some situations, but in EDH, of course, it's just always untapped, always going to tap for green or white, the colors that you need if you're playing green-white deck. And, the 1 life doesn't matter that much. Now, the Horizon lands, I think, are going to be a bit better because they can be sacrificed to draw a card. So if you flood out, you have a bunch of lands, you can sacrifice the Horizon Canopy to draw a card. And then you can recur these from the graveyard. You can draw multiple cards. So like cards like Life from the Loam or Ramanop Excavator can get these back from the graveyard to sacrifice them again to draw cards. And then, of course, if you play cards like Tarmogoyf for cards that have Delve or Delirium cards, putting cards in your graveyard is always good. But these Pain lands see a lot of play in Modern, or the Horizon lands see play in Modern. The Pain lands don't see play in Modern. They used to, But the Horizon lands and Pain lands I put on the same tier for EDH. These both see tons of play in EDH. The Horizon lands I think are a little bit better, but there are some situations in which the Pain lands are better because, ironically, the Pain lands have a painless option while the Horizon lands don't really have a painless option. So that's a slim situation in which you would use the Pain lands more. Both these types of lands probably are going to be in most EDH decks, but they're going to be your third option behind fetches and shocks and duels, are the Horizon lands and the Pain lands. Next, we have the Battlebond lands. So these are, I think, behind the Horizon lands and Pain lands, because the Horizon lands and Pain lands see play in multiple formats, while these really only can see play in EDH. So they're untapped lands that tap for 2 colorless in multiplayer games. So these only work in multiplayer games. So we'll read the green one, or the green-white one. It enters the battlefield tapped unless you have 2 or more opponents. So in EDH, you're going to have 3 opponents, so it'll enter untapped. However, in Modern or Legacy, these are really bad because they just enter tapped and they don't do anything. They're one of the best choices in EDH because they always enter untapped early in the game or mid-game, but they're unplayable in 60-card formats. They don't have a land type, so they can't be fetch with fetch lands or with ramp, but they are untapped lands that always give you the 2 colors you need. In EDH, I'd say these are on par with the Pain lands and the Horizon lands, but I think they're worse than the shock lands and fetch lands because they can't be, or they're worse than shock lands and dual lands because they can't be fetched out. There's also a weird situation in late games, so like if it's only you and one other opponent, and you draw one of these, they won't enter untapped because then you only have one opponent. But those are very niche situations where they won't be untapped, such as like very late game situations. And then you probably have enough mana, but they come up sometimes where you only have one opponent and you draw this tapped land. But yeah, these are definitely EDH staples. Play them in every EDH deck that you can play them in. Next, we're talking about the Triomes. Now, these are A tier. These see play in Modern and Legacy and in EDH. However, they can only be played in 3-color decks or more. You only really play them in like 4-color or 3-color decks because they always enter tapped. However, they're lands that tap for 3 colors of mana, and they can be fetched with fetch lands or with certain ramp like Nature's Lore, for instance. So if you have a Windswept Heath, you can find any of the lands that have green or white in them, which is gonna be able to fix you for all 5 colors of mana. So they're really good with fetch lands. So like, let's say you're playing a 4-color deck or a 5-color deck in Modern, which a lot of decks do. You have a Scalding Tarn. Oh, well, now that Scalding Tarn can fix you for all 5 colors of mana because you have Triomes out. That's crazy. They can be cycled if they're not needed late in the game, or if something like a Wrenn and 6 where you can buy them back from the graveyard and cycle them. They're perfect for mana fixing in 3-color, 4-color, and 5-color decks. They're not needed in 2-color decks, obviously, but I think you should see them in most 3-color or more decks. And one thing they do is allow for easy domain. So if you're playing a Modern 5-color deck with something like Scion of Draco or Leyline Binding, where they cost less for each land type you have, these Triomes will allow you to get 5 land types very easily and will allow you to cast those for 1 mana. I think 1 mana for Leyline Binding is pretty good. But yeah, the Triomes, the downside is they're always intertapped. And yeah, that's why you don't play them in 2-color decks. But if you're playing a 3-color or a 4-color or especially a 5-color deck, you should definitely play these. Next, we have the B tier, which are budget or 2-color EDH staples. So, Sunpetal Grove, right? I would not play this in a 4-color deck, but in my 2-color Selesnya deck, heck yeah, I would play Sunpetal Grove. So these are the buddy lands. These do not see play in Modern and Legacy. They're just not good enough. But they do see play in EDH decks. Actually, they do see play in Pioneer, which is interesting to me. And then they used to see play in Modern. The buddy lands require one of their land types to be in play before they enter untapped. It's not very difficult in 2-color decks, so these are good untapped sources in 2-color decks. They don't have the land types, but work well with land types. And then they're relatively easy to make to come into play untapped. They're not very difficult, especially if you do play shock lands and fetch lands, and basic lands, of course, will allow these to enter untapped. So these are pretty good in 2-color EDH decks. And yeah, that's what they're good in. They're still a really good option. Next, we have the fast and the slow lands. So I'll put these in B tier because they do see play in formats other than EDH, but in EDH, they're kind of weird. So fast lands are very good in early game situations or in fast formats like CEDH or Modern. They come into play untapped in the early game, but they slow you down in the mid and late game. So Razorverge Thicket, right? Or Spire Bluff Canal see lots of play in CEDH or Modern, but they don't really see much play in EDH because EDH games usually go longer. The slow lands like Overgrown Farmland, though, are very good in casual EDH as they come into play untapped in the mid and late games. However, in formats that are faster, they are basically unplayable. You'll never see these in Modern. You'll see them sometimes in Pioneer, because Pioneer is a slower format, but you never see the slow lands in Modern. However, I think that the reason they're in B tier is because they're very good in different formats. Like the fast lands, very good in CEDH, very good in Modern, not so good in Commander. The slow lands, very good in Commander and not so good in other formats. So that's why they're here. There's also the BFZ slow lands, which are searchable with the fetch lands, but require you to have 2 or more basics in play. They're not as good as the regular slow lands, but they're still a decent option in the 2-color decks. I would say that if you're playing a 2-color EDH deck, you would want to play the slow land, but you probably do not want to play the fast land because it'll mostly enter tap for you in the mid and late game, which isn't the best. Next, we have the best B tier land, filter lands, and these see play in Modern and in Commander, and I think they see play in CEDH too. They do not see play in Legacy. I think Legacy just everything is better. I put these slightly above B tier, but I talk about them last year because they're most complicated. They're untapped and can fix mana. However, they require you to have other lands that tap for one of the colors to make the mana. So they're not so good if they're your first land or your only type of land. Like if you're playing a 3-color deck and you have 2 of these filter lands or 3 of these filter lands, you're not going to make any colors of mana. But in most 2-color decks or in Modern where you have lots of fetch lands, you will be able to fix your mana pretty easily. These work really well at fixing your mana. They have the upside of fixing mana, being untapped, and always entering untapped even if they aren't useful. You can always just play this on turn 1, tap for a Soul Ring, right? But of course, you can play Forest and do the same thing. So, but a Forest doesn't tap for white. But this, you can have a Forest in play, you can have this in play, and then you can tap the Wooded Bastion for white. So, they're pretty versatile. And if you're playing a deck where you have a lot of mana intensive spells, so like Niv Mizzet, for instance, which costs blue, red, you're going to play the blue-red filter land so that you can make double blue or double red in certain situations. I think these are slightly above B tier because they see play in Commander and in Modern. So that's why they're slightly above B tier. I think these are good. And I think these are auto-includes in any 2-color deck. The 3-color deck, I think it gets a little bit dicey. I don't know if you'd play these in 3-color decks. In 4-color decks, definitely not. I think in 4-color decks, you just don't want to play it. But in 3-color decks, I could see playing this. Next, we have niche lands. So these are lands that are very good in certain situations, but are very weak in a lot of different situations. First of all is bounce lands. So these enter tapped, so they always enter tapped, but they tap for 2 mana. However, they require you to return a land you control to your owner's hand. These seem not so good at first glance, but they are very good with anything that untaps land, such as Kiyora's Follower, because you can untap the Selesnya Sanctuary to add 2 more mana. They're very good with cards like Amulet of Vigor and Spelunking, which will have them enter untapped so that they'll tap for 2 right away. Their synergy with Amulet of Vigor is the cornerstone of Modern Amulet Titan. They can also bounce important lands or themselves. So if you have an Amulet and you have multiple land drops, you can play Selesnya Sanctuary, tap for 2, bounce it, play it again, tap for 2, bounce it, right? If you have multiple land drops. They're also good for getting more landfall triggers. So if you have like Valakut or Tireless Tracker, you can play the bounce land to trigger it and then bounce it back, so you can keep triggering the landfall. They're very good in like Amulet Titan decks, or they're very good with Amulet of Vigor, Spelunking, anything that untaps lands, but in most decks, they're not good. In most decks, they're pretty bad. However, I will say, in most 2-color decks, playing a bounce land will allow you to rebuy important lands or double up your landfall triggers in certain niche situations. So I think these will see play in your 2-color decks. Anything above 2-color I would not play unless you have something like Amulet of Vigor or Spelunking, right? I don't know how good Amulet of Vigor is in Commander. It's very good in Modern because you have Urza Saga and you can play 4 of them, but in Commander I don't think it sees much play. Tainted lands or untapped lands that tap for 2 colors of mana, but only if you control a swamp. Obviously, these are very good in predominantly black decks or of Urborg. So if you're playing a black 3-color deck, you're going to play the Tainted lands. Or if you're playing even a black 4-color deck, you're going to be playing the Tainted lands. But if you're playing a deck that's not black, you're not playing the Tainted lands. So these are very good. Like Tainted Wood, one of the best cards in a Golgari deck, right? But it requires you to have a swamp, so obviously you're going to be playing these in black decks. They're in C tier because they're only playable in black decks, and they're a weird cycle where you have 4 of them: the black green, black blue, black red, and black white. But you only have 4 of them, and they're all black. They're really good for Urborg. But if you're playing a black deck, you already have swamps and stuff. So yeah, these are both niche lands, very good in certain specific decks, but in most decks, they're not good. I got the Lorwyn lands are good mana fixing in tribal decks that correspond to the tribes on the land. So Guiltleaf Palace comes into play. You may reveal an elf card from your hand, and it enters untapped. So that's going to be one of your best lands in a Golgari deck that plays elves. But if you don't play elves, it's going to be absolute garbage. I mean, that's pretty easy. And then there's one for Merfolk, there's one for Giants, and then there's one for Elementals. Thorn Glint Bridge is a artifact land that has Indestructible. So the artifact lands from Modern Horizons are good in Affinity or otherwise artifact-based decks. They also have Indestructible too, so you don't have to worry about them being blown up by artifact removal. Being artifacts, they synergize well with so many cards, like anything with Affinity, anything that counts the amount of artifacts you have, like Urza or Urza Saga, which makes constructs. So he's very good in those decks. However, there are certain cards that they synergize poorly against, like Karn the Great Creator or Stony Silence. So you gotta watch out for those if you're playing these Affinity lands. I think if you're playing a 2-color deck that is a artifact-based deck, you want to play these. But if you don't have any artifact synergies, then these are going to be pretty bad. You can also use Cleansing Wildfire as a ramp spell. So you can Cleansing Wildfire says destroy target land. Its owner searches for a basic. So you can destroy your own indestructible land and it won't be destroyed, and you just ramp yourself. That's pretty decent synergy. C tier Surveil lands. So these always enter tapped. I wish they always enter untapped. They always enter tapped. However, the Surveil trigger can help you with card selection and fill your graveyard for Delirium or Flashback. So, Surveil is pretty good because it fills your graveyard if you have cards that care about the card types in your graveyard or the number of cards in your graveyard, or you have cards that are cheaper in your graveyard or can be cast from the graveyard, then that's going to be good. These always enter tapped, so they're not the best, but they have land types, so they can be fetched up. So like you can Windswept Heath to get a Lush Portico if you need to Surveil. They have niche potential in certain decks, so if you're playing a deck that requires a lot of cards in the graveyard, or a deck that cares about filling the graveyard, then these are going to be very good. However, in other decks, they're pretty mediocre. I will say, though, in a 2-color Celestia deck, I think you should play Lush Portico, even though it enters tapped, because Surveil 1 is such good card selection. I think that's important. I think these are better than the Scry lands for multiple reasons. Surveil is better than Scry, and then these have land types, so they can be fetched up. I think they're pretty decent. I would not play them in Modern or Legacy, But I think in Pioneer and in Commander 2-color decks, they're pretty good. Next, we have D tier, and these are just bad. Um, I don't think you should play them. The reveal lands can enter untapped, but require you to have one of the land types in hand. These are a decent choice for 2-color decks, I think, but otherwise outclassed. And you have so many options for 2-color decks that we already talked about. Yeah, the cycling lands have land types and can cycle, but always enter tapped. They don't really do all that much for you. Cycling is kind of, I think if you can cycle something for 1 mana, it's good. But cycling something for 2 mana is kind of too much, and the cycling lands require you to pay 2 mana to cycle them. So I don't like them all that much. The pathways only tap for one of the 2 colors of mana, so they don't actually give any fixing. They are on tap, but they don't give you any fixing. That's why they're in D tier. The Scry lands are outclassed by Surveillance, but still an option if you want more control over the top of your deck. If you're playing something like Mael, or if you're playing something that flips cards from the top of your deck, then maybe Scry lands are a decent choice, but still, I think Surveillance are just so much better. More D tier. Man lands or creature lands. They do fix mana, and they can be turned into a creature late game. However, they always interplay tapped and require a heavy mana investment to turn them into creatures. I just don't think it's worth it in most decks. Celestial Colony I used to see a lot of play in modern control decks, but it doesn't see play anymore because there's just better options. Fetchable Snowlands are very budget and do have some synergy of Snow Matter cards, but they always enter tapped. And, I mean, if you're not playing any Snowland synergies, they're not going to be that great. The Strixhaven campus is always enter tapped, but in late game you can control your draws. They allow you to pay 4 to scry, which is kind of bad. The new Capenna lands are similar, but they let you draw a card for 4 mana. Also kind of bad. The gain lands, which come and enter and gain you a life, are good if you have life gain synergy, or very budget. Now we're going to talk about the interesting D tier cards. So I thought these are probably the top of the D tier, but I put these on their own slide because they're more interesting. Like, obviously, you know, the fetchable Snowlands. If you play a snow deck, you're going to play those. If you're not playing a snow deck, you're not going to play those. Reveal lands are good in a budget deck, right? Scry lands are good in certain situations. But these are more interesting because they're more good in various different types of decks, but I still think they're bad. So Odyssey filter lands are not as good as the normal filter lands. They can filter mana into one of 2 colors. So the green-white filter land can tap for green-white, green-green, or white-white. The green-white Odyssey filter land can only tap for green-white. However, it doesn't require you to have the green or white available, so you can have just any land and tap this. But it doesn't tap for mana without other lands available. And it only taps for green-white, so it doesn't filter as well as the Lorwyn filter lands, and they don't tap for mana by themselves. So that's why they don't see play in Legacy and Modern, and they're not as good as the regular filter lands in Commander. The slow fetch lands enter tapped, but they otherwise have the same advantages as fetch lands do. They fix your mana. They get, you know, your top of your deck shuffled in, and they can, I mean, they can fill your graveyard too, right? But they always enter tapped. So that's a big disadvantage. Like, we don't want to just play lands that enter tapped because that puts you behind a turn. But they're still interesting because they do have the same advantages as fetch lands do, but they're just slow. So anyways, these are lands that are worse versions of very good lands, but because they're worse versions of very good lands, they're bad, but they're still interesting. And, you know, I could see an argument. Like, if you want more fetch lands in your deck, I could see playing grasslands. But then at the same time, you can always just play off-color fetches, so I don't see an argument of playing grasslands ever. If you're playing like a green-white 2-color deck, I still don't think Sungrass Fairy is good because it just doesn't tap for mana by itself. I don't think Grasslands is good. So yeah, maybe in certain weird decks you might want to play these, but I don't think they're good. That's why they're in D tier. And next we have the cards that are just don't play these. They just don't. They're not even on the screen because they're just so bad. And I'm not even going to talk about them. The fetchable tapped lands are fetchable, but they always enter tapped. We have better versions of those that are still bad. The guild gates, they just always enter tapped. Now there are some benefits to playing guild gates if you're playing like a Mazes in deck or something like that. In those decks, I'd play those, but in most decks, you don't play guild gates. The storage lands are just really bad. The Kamigawa tap lands, so these are lands that they tap, and then on the next turn, they don't untap. Yeah, they tap for mana on one turn, and then they don't untap on the next turn. And they also yeah, they're just not good because it's like one turn it's like, oh, I have access to 2 mana. Next turn it's like, oh, well, one of my lands just doesn't untap. Yeah, it's pretty sad, isn't it? Now, if you have something that just untaps all of your lands, then maybe they're decent, but having something like Wilderness Reclamation required to make them playable is not very good. And then depletion lands, you have to like put counters on them and then tap them to remove the counters. They're just not good. Anyways, we talked about the lands in Magic. We talked about the fetch lands, why they're so good. Talked about the best lands that actually tap for mana, shocks and duels. We talked about Pain lands and Horizon lands, which I absolutely love. They're very good, especially the Horizon lands. And Pain lands have their own situations. They're very good in EDH. The Horizon lands are just better in other formats, but they're very similar, so that's why they're in the same tier. We talked about the Battlebond lands, perfect for Commander, very bad in other formats. Talked about the Triomes, how good they are in 3-color or 4-color decks. Talked about the Buddy lands, perfect for 2-color decks. The fast and slow lands, their weaknesses and strengths, and which decks they should see play in. Talked about the filter lands and why they're good, but also they have some downsides. We talked about these niche lands, such as bounce lands, the tainted lands, or the Lorwyn lands, or the artifact lands. Talked about surveil lands, and we talked about bad lands, not the card bad land, but bad land cycles. Odyssey filter lands, slow fetch lands being the most interesting of them. And then we talked about the ones that you should absolutely not play. Anyways, thank you very much for watching this video. If you liked it, let me know what you think about lands in the comments below. Let me know what you think about this video. Consider liking and subscribing and then sharing these to people who need to know about lands. Anyways, thank you. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Oh, I forgot. I forgot to talk about basic lands. So, yeah. Well, these are all just the dual lands, but basic lands are going to probably be A tier. You should always play basic lands in your deck because they always enter untapped and they work well with things like your buddy lands or your slow lands. So, yeah, you should always play basic lands. Yeah. Even in a 5-color deck, you should always play at least one of each one, just in case someone has Blood Moon or something. Anyways, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.